You're very welcome along to this week's episode of the group chat here on Virgin Media News. Richard and Gavin in studio. Gavin, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
And Zara, of course, joining us live from the Southern News Bureau. Thank you very much for joining us, Zara. How are you?
I'm good, guys. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. We have a very packed schedule this week. We're going to start with the housing issue. We have, we're effectively 6 months on now from a general election where housing was perhaps the central theme. There's been a lot of early pressure on the government, Gavin, I suppose, to say, to get a move on with addressing it. One of the key issues has been around rent. We've had record rents. We have record homelessness as well. One of the things they said that they were going to do, and it has been contentious in the build-up to it, was look at rent pressure zones. Now, they have done that. What exactly have they done?
What they have done, there's a couple of things to what they've done. What they've done first and foremost is that the existing rent pressure zone system, which was going to expire naturally at the end of the year, is now going to be continued, and actually it's going to be made nationwide, and there's a dispute over the timing of that, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So that's the first thing. So the existing protections that apply to most tenants, annual caps of 2% on your rent increases and the likes of that, will now be almost universal in the short term. But what they've decided they need to do to try and make sure that more units come into the system is relax that ever so slightly for new tenancies as and from next March, so that increases can be beyond 2%, albeit no higher than the rate of inflation, but that every 6 years the landlord will have the right to reset to market rates. So you might have something which appears fair for a while, ends up then undercutting the market rate for a few years, and if you're lucky enough to be still in the property 6 years later, the landlord has the right to turn around and say, right, this is what I think the market would apply. So it's simultaneous, it's kind of Schrodinger's protections, where you're protected for 5 years out of 6, and then the 6th year you are effectively thrown to the wolves. And the debate in the Dáil has been very much around which of those two halves of the same coin do you want to pay attention to.
Off the top of my head, just hearing how that works, you would expect that people who have short-term tenancies, potentially like students, for example, will be the worst affected by this, because they're having a complete reset effectively every single year. Then.
Yeah. Now, they don't always have to. And if you were going to college and you might be there for 3 or 4 years, you might like to hang on to the same place for 3 or 4 years. But if you're going on Erasmus, as a lot of people do, I went on Erasmus once, it was a mandatory thing, I had no option about it. You're leaving in the middle of a 6-year cycle, and one of the rules the government is writing in is that if a tenant leaves voluntarily, so it's not just the natural end of a lease, or the landlord's not kicking them out, if somebody breaks the lease voluntarily, you have the right to reset it on the spot. So if you had an apartment block that was close to a major university campus, which was privately owned and privately let out, and a lot of those were built to let, you'd possibly have a situation where the rent could get reset basically every year or every second year, because the clients will be constantly turning over, voluntarily breaking the lease because they don't want 6 years at a time, and then finding the situation where year upon year upon year, the new students are paying more and more and more than what the rest of the market is.
So the housing minister says in response to all this that rents at the moment are too high. They're far too high is what he says.
And the goal is to bring them down.
And the goal is to bring them down, right? We'll come to that bit in a second. What's going to happen to rents in the quote unquote the short term as a result of this, according to the report drawn up for said housing minister? In
the words of the late great George Michael, got to get up to get down.
Yeah.
So what they are basically conceding is that in order for rents to go down, they have to come up again. And you can analyse whether that's a sensible approach. I mean, the government's effective gambit is that you need to make investment attractive, that the government doesn't have enough money to build all the houses for the country by itself. It needs some private money to come in and do that for it. But that Ireland is presently not attractive enough, so you have to offer people a reasonable rate of return and reasonable rent increases to make it worth their while. I would query the rationale of that, because if you are a large institutional landlord, say, for example, you've got 10 apartment blocks around Dublin or around the country, and there's 100 rooms in each. And if you are thinking about building an 11th one, are you going to build the 11th one if you think that yours is going to be the point at which the market tips over, and then you basically lower the market rate for the other 10? I don't think any individual builder is going to do that. So what they're effectively hoping is that landlords then kind of have this lemmings effect where they all run over the cliff edge together, unwittingly devaluing all of their own properties or their own incomes in doing so. I'm not convinced that's how it's going to work, but the general rule of supply and demand is that you're only ever going to bring down prices by having more properties there, and this is their gambit of trying to make it more attractive to do so.
So the report for the housing minister said that standardised average rents will increase in the short term, and outlined that it will take at least 3 to 4 years for the investment to result in more homes being built. The idea, Zara, of this being quote unquote short term pain for renters, it's a bit of a misnomer, because this is immediate pain effectively is what it's going to be. The rise in rent that we have seen, the rate of increase we've seen for renters across the board for years now has been very, very steep. It's not going to be alleviated whatsoever as a result of this. So what are renters telling you?
Well, so it was interesting. We actually spent a bit of time with one renter on Tuesday when this was first announced, and he was telling us that he and his wife had been renting in Cork City in Montenotte, obviously a nice area, Montenotte, a place that people would know and be familiar with in Cork. But he said the house that they were living in was a 2-bedroom, very small terraced house, and that there were 5 adults living in that house. He and his wife were in one bedroom. A man who had lived in the house for a few years before them was in the other bedroom. And there was another couple living downstairs in the living room. And that tenancy lasted for 5 years. It was what the couple could afford at the time in terms of trying to save for a mortgage. They were able to obviously split the rent costs in that house between 5 adults to try and save some money. And his situation was such that then when he went to save for the deposit, they managed to gather up a deposit to then be told that actually what they could get for a mortgage, or even to get a mortgage, was going to be so difficult that actually the idea of owning a house was out of reach at that point. So he and his wife then subsequently were looking for somewhere else to live so they could live alone together. They've ended up moving quite far outside Cork City. They're actually living in a rural part of West Cork now. And they're paying €1,000 a month between them for this house. And it's in a rent pressure zone. I mean, but he says himself that actually the truth of the matter is that in a lot of cases, if a landlord wants to increase the rent and people have nowhere else to go, then it's just going to happen. You know, he says, you know, who's going to complain to the RTB when you run the risk of being evicted, or you run the risk of, you know, damaging a relationship with a landlord that you're completely reliant on in terms of your shelter and accommodation. So, you know, he believes that, okay, while these protections are, you know, in place in theory, that in reality, the lived reality for people is they're not going to rock the boat with somebody they're relying on to keep them safe and warm. That
was actually a really unspoken point of James Brown's press conference on Tuesday, where he was asked about the enforcement of this, and he did talk about the need to have more personnel working in the RTB to be able to mediate on complaints like that. But he was also asked, how are you going to know for certain that the rent pressure zone or the rent caps are actually being abided by? Like, if you are a new tenant in a property, all you know is the rent that you're being charged, but you don't know what the rent was for the previous tenant and the last point at which it was reviewed. And we asked, was there going to be a rent register for some sort of transparency for this? And he said it's a thing that they might have down the line, but it's not a thing they're going to have yet. And he would encourage people to go and complain to the RTB if they were to find out that the rent caps are being broken. Firstly, how are you going to find out? And B, given that it's such a seller's market right now and that the landlords effectively hold all the cards, do you have the scope to make a complaint to the RTB about your landlord, even if you do think you're being scammed or if your rights are being trampled upon, given that the shortage of housing is so acute that you'll basically be burning your bridges with your landlord and kind of have to move out as a result of the complaint you're going to make? Like, it's not feasible you'd make a complaint about your landlord and still live in their lodgings, in their dwelling, until you've thrashed all of that out. So you're going to leave. So, like, you're by acknowledging that you might have been screwed, you are again entrusting yourself to the vultures of the market, because you don't know where you're going to end up and how much you might end up paying as a result. So the enforceability of all this is definitely an open question, you know.
I think it was back in February, Micheál Martin said to, I think it was the parliamentary party, Fianna Fáil TDs, that there would be unpopular decisions that would need to be taken with regards to housing. I think this is one of the ones that he had signalled was going to be down the line on this. Focus Ireland reacting to this, saying that this is going to be, in their view, something that effectively is going to put people into homelessness by virtue of the fact they simply won't be able to afford the rent. The biggest cause of homelessness, according to Focus Ireland, in recent months and for the last period of time, has been the end of tenancies, landlords saying that they're selling up, therefore your tenancy is over. It previously, before that, was rent simply too high, can't be afforded. So they think this is going to go back to that situation. You've had public sector unions, including unions representing non-consultant hospital doctors, saying this is the wrong way we're going here. Because
that's another example, like students, where like they're only ever in places short term.
They're on rotations, all that sort of stuff. So this affects them as well. I just feel, Zara, given that this is, you know, we are due to have the housing plan launch next month, isn't it?
Yes.
July was the plan for housing on this. You're rolling out this one policy, which is going to, and everybody admits it, is going to jack up rents even higher than they are from record levels. In the overall goal is to boost supply, perhaps 3 to 4 years down the line, according to the report given to the housing minister. That is a very, very big ask to renters, to put up with 3 to 4 years of increasing rents, and it probably won't come down beyond that point. That's just a point at which they expect it to somewhat, you know, moderate out of that point. Should they have unveiled something else? I mean, you look at something which could boost supply immediately. You look at policy decisions taken elsewhere in Europe, like, you know, reductions in the availability of Airbnbs. I was listening to one radio conversation a couple of days ago. One landlord who owns Airbnb says, nah, this thing isn't going to make me isn't going to tempt me away from having this out as a short-term let for tourists on Airbnb. So surely if you're going to do something which is going to hit renters hard in the pocket, you should do something which will immediately boost supply as well to try and alleviate that. Would you not think that would be potentially a sensible way of doing things in tandem?
Well, absolutely. And I think as well, like, it kind of doesn't take into consideration the fact that most renters are people who are striving to hopefully own or buy their own house one day, who are already pinned to the collar and probably spending far above what they can afford to live in these rental properties in the first place. So you've got a lot of people who are possibly spending upwards of 60 or 70% of their monthly income on housing, and then trying to save whatever is left, and then also then trying to, like everyone, buy groceries, pay their bills, and maybe have something left over to maybe enjoy a little bit of their lives. I don't think that a lot of renters, can afford to find themselves in a situation where there's any extra pain. They're in enough pain right now as it is.
Yeah, on that point, that's so interesting. I mean, we've focused a lot of the conversation amongst younger people at this point, like students, student doctors or non-consultant hospital doctors. There was the Child Poverty Monitor, which came out earlier this week, that found that effectively 100,000 children in this country face consistent poverty. That number all but doubling in the space of the year. Rent has been named as one of the number one drivers of that poverty. Effectively, thousands of families forced to live on such tight margins that they live in constant fear of their child needing a hospital visit or getting a letter home about the next school trip. It's a very, very difficult line for the government to walk if they are going to be increasing rent, when that is for families, as you say, Zara, who have been driven to this position where they are already in a position of effectively enforced detriment at this point. I mean, that's a very, very difficult position for people to be in.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, Sam Toomey, the young person I had in the report the other evening, the renter that I was talking to, made that valid point that, why is it that we are in one of the most economically rich countries in Europe? Why is it then that our people are continuing to struggle like this? It's such a legitimate question. And Gavin, do we get any answers to questions like that from the government?
No, we don't. I actually think it's been really striking how little conversation there's been or discourse around Leinster House or in official circles about the findings of that. Actually, it's a point that I think we'll ourselves will probably come back to in the next couple of weeks. But what's really striking is that no matter how appalling some of those findings might be, and the sheer rate of escalation of child poverty and the deprivation that there is, that it just doesn't appear to properly register on official government Dublin 2's radar, that it's not a point at which you hear any immediate response or any immediate concern, nothing from the Minister for Children, nothing from the Minister for Social Protection. It's all quiet because it's almost as if they're not aware of it happening. Yeah,
and just when you see how much truck the government gives to our young people are our best asset. Our best defence for our economy is having a workforce of young graduates who are super well educated, some of the best in Europe. And then they do something which their own reports say will drive up the rents for these people because none of them are going to be able to afford homes. Are we not damaging our best asset, which the government says is our best asset, the best way of insulating ourselves from all of the economic pressures ahead of ourselves? It does seem like this is a very much a tightrope to walk on.
And I'm old enough to remember when this was going to be the best small country in the world in which to grow up. And I'm old enough to remember the Taoiseach before last, 3 years ago when he took office, setting up a new child poverty unit in the department of the Taoiseach, which appears to have achieved very little and has sort of been overtaken by another unit that the most recent Taoiseach set up for childhood disability issues, which obviously is still a work in progress as well. The Airbnb point is a really salient one because the quickest way to increase supply, if the government's ultimate ambition is to bring down rents by increasing supply, you can redirect or redivert the supply that's already there, which in many cases is being let out as short-term lettings without the planning permission to do it. Bear in mind, you need to have planning permission for your property to be used as an Airbnb or similar for 90 days or more, and most people don't have it. And the reason why it can't be enforced is because when you go onto Airbnb, you don't get the air code of the exact property that's being advertised. So the government can't check out, unless it makes a booking, which property is being advertised. So the enforcement is really difficult. And it's a thing that they say they're working on. I've mentioned before, it's not in the programme for government. It doesn't appear to be a short-term priority for anyone. But you'd think it would be a way that would suddenly, possibly, not maybe flood the market, but suddenly introduce loads more rental properties to the market that isn't there right now. And everyone will tell you that the ultimate driver of high rents is the fact there aren't enough properties to live in the first place.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning as well, the rent pressure zones introduced in 2016, so effectively a decade now of a housing crisis where these have been needed. What's been the mood around Leinster House in terms of how has this gone down, this perhaps move? Because it was floated over the weekend, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It floated over the weekend and then there were some key changes in it, but everybody who isn't in government, it should be said, seems
seems quite unhappy. Although actually there was a very salient observation made by opposition parties on Tuesday and Wednesday, which is that because the new system of caps with the slightly higher scope for increases takes effect from next March, there was an incentive for landlords to leave properties empty or to try and get rid of the tenant that they've currently got. Because if they let it out from next March, the annual caps will be higher, and every 6 years you can jack it up to whatever the market decrees. And today, Thursday, Simon Harris said, we're rushing forward a bill next week to extend the existing RPZs nationwide. Now, good. It's a good way of getting around that problem. It helps to address the stockpiling. But when Micheál Martin was asked about stockpiling in the Dáil on Tuesday and Wednesday, he didn't say that was the thing they're doing. The press release that James Brown put out on Tuesday to confirm the details of this made no mention of short-term legislation to extend previous cover. When Micheál Martin was in Leaders' Questions Tuesday, Wednesday, no mention of it. James Brown did a press conference on Tuesday, no sign of it. So make you wonder then, well, why didn't they just say that in the last couple of days? Or is it another case of them looking to patch up a vulnerability that they've only suddenly discussed? And one final point, because I know we need to move on. When RPZs were being moved or introduced in 2016, it was explicitly said by the then government that you couldn't have RPZs on a uniform national basis. You couldn't have rent caps just applied to the entire state because it would be unconstitutional. That landlords have property rights which have been reinforced by different cases and rulings in the Supreme Court, and that having a single blunt national measure that it's limited their scope for increases was unconstitutional. And next week we're going to introduce a bill which introduces blunt nationwide blanket increases or caps on how much you can increase your rent. If it was unconstitutional back in 2016, why are we doing it now? Or are they doing it now admitting that RPZs could have been nationwide, that there could have been much more protection for renters all the way along, if only they'd gotten a different legal opinion to say so?
Yeah. Zara, how do you think this is going to play out for them then over the next number of weeks and months when these actually do effectively take impact?
Well, I think the immediate response isn't going to be great, is it? Actually, I just wanted to make a point as well, because I meant to say to you that we did get an email last week from a listener when we were talking about the Housewife of the Year programme, and it was more in the context of, how life has changed so much in Ireland in terms of the family and households. And the person who had written into us was a working mum herself. She'd been a nurse, but she was talking about how her mum had been at home with the kids, and how actually, nowadays our generation doesn't have that choice anymore, that the choice has been taken away from the generation now for women who might want to choose to be in the home that they can't necessarily afford to do that actually the idea that you could run a household on one person's wage now in 2025 in Ireland just isn't realistic in a lot of ways. And she was saying that actually we shouldn't while it's amazing to look back on this and look at the faults of all of it, she said actually the idea of having the option to be at home was actually taken away from women nowadays. So, okay, well, the option to go out to work was taken away from women at a certain point in this country. It's actually gone the other direction now. And the question is really, without that choice, how does it really impact families?